In the last section, we were able to handle an error occurring during our geolocation request, but like I mentioned at the end, it's probably not for the best for us to just put the word error right here. It's definitely pretty unsettling for our users. So in this section, we're going to figure out how to handle the case in which we do not have an error or the case in which we do. Now, I want to first begin by thinking about all the different combinations of state that we can have inside of our component right now. In total, there's 3 different combinations of latitude and error message that we could run into. So we can run into a situation where we have a latitude, but we do not have an error message. If we have a latitude and no error message, we probably want to show the user our latitude. Just print it on the screen. Remember that the final version of our app is not going to show the latitude, but for right now, let's just try to show the latitude. Then the second case, we might have our latitude, or excuse me, not have a latitude, but we might have an error. So this would occur in the case that a user denied our geolocation request. So if that's the case, then I want to show the error and not show the latitude, not even show the text latitude or anything like that. I just want to show an error message by itself. And then finally, I also want to handle the case in which our application is still loading up and still making that geolocation request. Remember, right now, I am faking my location. So whenever I do a request, you see that it loads up instantaneously. And I'm doing this just so that as you see me doing this work, you don't have to sit around and watch me wait for 5 seconds for something to show up. But when a user first uses our application, it is going to take about 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds for something to load up. During that time, we probably want to tell the user that they are waiting for something. We want to let them know, hey, just hold on a second. We're going to show you something interesting in just a moment. So I want to handle all 3 of these different scenarios. So to do so, I'm going to flip back over to my code editor, and I'm going to find my render method. So in order to kind of conditionally return some different JSX, all we have to do is put a simple collection of if statements into this render method. Now this is going to be the most simple and straightforward way of doing this, and we're going to eventually come back and refactor it into a slightly more elegant way, but let's start simple. Okay, so I'm going to delete everything inside the render method for right now. And then I'll put in 3 different statements. Actually, how about just 2 if statements? First off, I will say if we have an error message and we do not have a latitude, then I want to return a div that contains my error message. So I'll say error this.state.error message, like so. So that's going to handle this case right here, the case in which we do not have a latitude, but we have an error message. So in that case, I want to show an error. So if we have an error message and no lat, great, show the error. Straightforward enough. So now I'll give myself a little bit of space and I'll put down my next if statement. I'll say if I do not have an error message, and I have a latitude. So notice in this case, I don't have the not on there. I've got the not right there and the not right there. So if I have a latitude, then I want to return a div with latitude this.state.lat. And then finally, for the third case down here, this would be the scenario in which I have no latitude and no error message. I want to show loading. So for this case down here, this would be kind of like a catch-all. I could turn these into some if-else statements and then put an else for the final case, but personally I like to just do if statements with returns in them. And then for the final case down here, I don't really need an if statement. I can just say, if we failed these 2 checks, then chances are we have neither latitude nor error message. So I'll say simply return a div that says loading, like so. Okay, so that's it. Now this right here is what we refer to as conditional rendering. We are returning different JSX depending upon the state or the props of our component. We're going to use conditional rendering quite a bit throughout this course, and this is the most simple and straightforward way to go about it. Even in this application, once we understand how this block right here works, we're going to refactor it into something that looks a little bit nicer than what you see. All right, so I'm going to flip back over to my browser. And now I see that I already have my latitude on here. I can do another refresh, and I see just the latitude by itself. So let's test out the 2 other scenarios here. I'm going to reset my location by setting it to ask default, and then I'll reload the page. Now in the background here, we do not yet have a error message or a latitude. So I know this darn pop-up right here makes it hard to see, but if again I do an inspect, you'll see that it says right there loading. And well, I mean, you can see it in the background. So I do not have an error message, I do not have a latitude, so I'm going to show loading. But if I then allow, it's going to turn into latitude. And now I'll try the other case. So I'll do another ask default, I will refresh, and now I'm going to block it this time around, and now I see the error instead. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So now we now have a better idea of how to do conditional rendering. And like I said, this is something we're going to practice many, many times throughout this course. All right, so let's take a quick pause right here. We'll continue in the next section, and we'll continue working on our app.